Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Levi-Faur, and I'm happy to host you for a new webinar series on intermediaries, regulation via intermediaries, regulation by intermediaries, and of course, regulation of the intermediaries, because everyone is regulator and should be also regulated when we are doing politics and policy in a democratic world. Today with me also Agnieszka Smoleńska, who will present herself. Agnieszka, say a few words
Hello,
about yourself.
everyone. Sure. I'm Agnieszka Smoleńska. I'm an assistant professor at the Polish Academy of Sciences and senior policy fellow at the LSE now. I also spent some time with David at the Hebrew University as a postdoc. So we'll be today discussing the fruit of that collaboration then.
Excellent. And I'm David Levi-Faur, a professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the host of this webinar series. So thank you for joining us, and we'll start with the presentation. Agnieszka, can you please present? So here is the topic. It's about trust and regulation, trust via regulatory intermediaries, and about the issue of greenwashing and the rating providers in the case of environmental ESG rating provider in sustainable finance. And here we bring the expertise of Agnieszka with the issue of sustainable finance, European Union rating provider, and my interest is trust and intermediaries. So greenwashing is a problem of trust, right? Greenwashing suggesting that something is green, but without the credibility of really being green. What does it mean to be green? For this, we have public discussion, right? But also we have rating providers which tell us to what extent something or someone is green. So this paper is about trust and regulation in the context of energy transition, and we shed light on regulatory intermediation as a trust building and repair approach. So intermediation is a solution, but at the same time it is a problem. Can we trust the trustee? Can we trust the intermediaries? The empirical strategy is a comparative analysis of the EU and UK approach to ESG rating providers regulation. We study the two polities. We put them in the context of global norms of what is green, or what is a good green, or what is a good sustainable finance. And then we analyze the problems of intermediation. Our contribution with this paper is not only to bring the intermediaries and the trust issue into the center of the analysis, but also bringing this intermediation literature into the self-regulation literature, combining and looking at development, institutional development of how we do market-based regulation or self-regulation via intermediaries. So this is the rationale. We start with a criticism of the dyadic model of regulation. We have rule makers and rule takers and trustors and trustees, and these literatures are both dyadic, but they don't speak together. They don't come together. So we have a legal literature on trustor and trustees, and the regulation literature on rulemaking and rule taker. But I think we need to bring them together. And here is the triadic model that the next slide will present. So we say, look, governance is let's think about governance as a three actors model, where the relation between the actors can be more trust, less trust, distrust, and trust, but can be also more regulation, less regulation, meaning deregulation, or new ways of regulation. And one of those actors is the intermediary. In our case, the empirical case is the ESG rating provider. So we are moving to triadic model of regulation. In the literature that we started 2017, published in the Annals of Regulation, we call it the RIT model. We can move another slide, Agnieszka, please. You see the special issue, and we put it as a three model interaction, and we distinguish now and focus more clearly here on governance by intermediaries as a solution for a trust problem, but also the need to govern the intermediary because the solution itself creates new problem. So, and of course you can bring, when you have a regulation problem, you can bring the state, right? The state or the public authority and so on. But here we want to keep, not only the industry is keeping its kind of sort of self-regulation, okay? They keep the autonomy around regulation. So here, this is where we are, and we have three research questions in the next slide. Empirically, what is the political dynamic around the adoption of ESG rating provider rules in the EU and the UK? And then what is the differences in those strategies of trust repair between the two polities? And then the question is, why care? Why care policy-wise, making the world better, making a better world via better governance, but also why care theoretically? So this is the agenda. And now the floor is yours, Agnieszka. Agnieszka? Oh, something is wrong here. We'll wait a minute and things will come down. Agnieszka? I think I was disconnected, Agnieszka? Yeah? Shall I repeat the research questions?
That would be right, yeah.
So we have three research questions. The first is analyzing the political dynamic of the ESG rating provider rules in the EU and the UK in the context of green finance. Thereafter, the second question is, what are the differences between the strategies that were taken by the UK and the EU? And the third question is, why care? Meaning, why care for a better governance, better world, but also why care because theoretically, what is the theoretical importance or usefulness of this paper? And those questions will be answered now by Agnieszka. So the floor is yours.
Sorry, it's always a bit tricky to mute and unmute when you're sharing. Okay, so David already signaled the importance of ESG rating providers in this particular space, but I appreciate also that not everyone may be familiar with with who these guys are and why they have emerged and what kind of problems they seek to solve, especially as you can very much make the argument that ESG ratings emerge partly as a result of trust problems between firms who have specific environmental, social, governance characteristics and investors and stakeholders who don't take for granted what these companies say. And they need some kind of a trusted intermediary to provide them with trustworthy information about the sustainability credentials of a particular real economy firm. It's really important here to kind of emphasize also that in the specific transition context, clearly we care more about what happens with real economy firms. That is, that they meaningfully improve their environmental and social performance rather than whatever happens in the financial markets, right? So we treat transition as a real economy phenomenon where there is meaningful change that has an impact on environment and society rather than a financial phenomenon. Now, what ratings do and how rating providers operate is that they take information that is typically publicly disclosed by a given company, but not necessarily, and they offer summary information on sustainability profile of a given firm. They synthesize this into summary data such as ratings or scores that may inform investment and stakeholder decisions. It allows investors and stakeholders to assess a particular company, but also to compare one company and with other ones, either within the same sector or across sectors. So from a theoretical perspective, what ESG ratings do is that they translate a lot of the noise, communication, PR, that companies make as to their sustainability credentials and translate this into a signal. We can see the origins of the ESG rating phenomenon, which is linked and parallel to credit ratings that some of you might have heard of, but it's clearly distinguished from credit ratings is that it doesn't necessarily rely on backward-looking data, and it tries to also explain and integrate forward-looking information into assessing a particular firm. So the ESG ratings date back to 1980s when we saw the emergence of a kind of ethical, also religiously driven type of investing based on exclusions, etc. But we really see this market take off since 2000s, especially after in 2004, there is a big push also within the UN to integrate ESG in global business community. There is a report that UN publishes, Who Cares Wins, which creates kind of this framework for ESG as a risk measure. Subsequently, especially after 2015 and the Paris Agreement, where we have big global claims around aligning global capital flows with a livable world, is where when we also see growing marketization of this market segment with a number of the smaller providers who used to be specialized in this space are being acquired by the big names such as Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and Morningstar. So we see big concentration in this market. And with this, with great power comes great responsibility, of course. So as ESG rating providers become more and more important part of the market, now these rating providers rate tens of thousands of firms, and these firms then use this data to communicate with their stakeholders, with their investors. They use these ratings to design specific financing instruments. It affects their costs of capital, etc. So quite far-reaching consequences. But since with great power comes great responsibility, we see increasing scrutiny of what ESG ratings do. And there are two particular problems that a lot of critics have pointed to. One is the fact that very often there is a lot of misunderstanding about the substantive aspects of ESG ratings. So what is it that they measure, whether it's the financial materiality, so whether companies take into account that if they contribute to negative social outcomes or negative environmental outcomes, that this will affect their performance in the future as a result of various legal actions, for example, or is it about checking how companies actually positively impact on the world around them? And secondly, a second criticism that is given as a way to undermine trustworthiness of ESG ratings in particular is the fact that different companies have different ratings from different providers. So whereas for credit ratings, typically we see whether it's S&P, whether it's Moody's, or others, there is largely because of methodological convergence, there is convergence in the ratings that these providers give to particular ESG to particular firms. In the case of ESG ratings, we see different ratings from different providers. Now, this is a very important observation from a trust perspective, because one of the things that we are interested in the trust as a space for vulnerability, as we know from literature, is how do you create a framework within which it's okay to be different, right? So it's very valid that different ratings using different methodologies may arrive at different assessments of sustainability because they value relatively different dimensions, more or less, for example. So what we are trying to do when thinking about restoring trust in ESG rating providers is also thinking about institutional design for regulatory intermediaries, which is broad enough and enables establishment of a trust repair and trust building regulatory regime that accommodates difference. So we do not necessarily need convergence and just one ESG metric, because given heterogeneity of societal preferences, that's not likely to be achievable. Now, as a result of the rising importance of ESG rating providers in the market, and also the way in which such ratings are consequential for costs of capital, access to capital, stakeholder engagement, etc., and given the problems that have been outlined, we see at the global level a push towards regulation in this space. So IOSCO, that is an organization that brings together supervisors from different jurisdictions in 2021, developed a recommendation for how we could approach regulation of ESG rating providers. They specifically raise a number of problems that I already mentioned to you. So problems with ESG data, lack of transparency around methodology, lack of clarity also as to whether this is a single or double materiality, questionable reliability of ESG ratings and possible conflicts of interest, and communication problems between ESG ratings and data providers. Now, what is important, though, from our trust repair, trust building perspective, is that when we try to bring together what the regulatory recommendations are in the space with what we know from the trust literature, that the qualities of a trustworthy entity would be, it really maps quite nicely and fits quite nicely together. So the recommendations from IOSCO focus on 3 dimensions. On the one hand, it's about ensuring that the ESG rating providers have the right abilities. For example, that means ensuring that they have adequate resources to assess complex matters such as ESG. On the secondly, the recommendations target specific benevolence dimensions of ESG rating providers. In particular, they offer regulatory solutions to make clear the motivations and relationships with users, so both investors and the rated companies. And there are also recommendations put in place regarding integrity, so how internal processes should look like within the ESG rating providers to ensure integrity of their services and actions. On this basis, both the EU and the UK have developed quite different regulatory regimes. And what we've done with David over the past several months is to have a number of conversations with policymakers, complemented with kind of comparative literature of what has gone on in both these jurisdictions. So now I will present briefly the main features of the two regimes before comparing them and drawing conclusions from a trust regulatory perspective. So the EU introduces mandatory rules. It's not a super surprise. We all know EU loves regulation, but what is quite important here in the context of the EU that this is a regulation that is a part of a much broader scheme. So the EU is really putting a lot of effort into making a particular market for sustainable finance as a way to overcome a number of constraints within the EU framework when it comes to accelerating the transition, such as the inability for member states to agree on a lot of things. So there is the EU ESG rating regulation is part of a much broader piece, broader agenda that is about creating common foundations for what do we understand by sustainability, a common disclosure regime, metrics regime, a common kind of underpinned by a number of sectoral legislation as well. It is quite a far-reaching regime when it comes to centralization. So the regulation that has been adopted this year requires mandatory authorization within the EU of ESG rating providers with an EU agency called ESMA that sits in Paris. ESMA will also be responsible for oversight over specific aspects of ESG ratings operation. There is a full legislative process, so that means EU Commission proposed the regulation, member states and the parliamentarians had to agree. So this is a full-blown legislative intervention. It is a disclosure-based regime. First, there is an authorization requirement for ESG rating providers, and they will be directly supervised. But in addition, there are a number of obligations related to disclosure, both vis-a-vis the market and vis-a-vis the investors and users. So it's quite a complex regime that tries to regulate trust relationships between different actors. It says it doesn't interfere with methodologies of ESG rating providers, but when we delve deeper into the content of the disclosures that are required by very granular templates, we see that there are indirect ways in which the EU suggests to rating providers what an ESG rating that is trustworthy and credible should look like. Now, this is, unsurprisingly for many regulatory scholars, the UK, especially after Brexit, adopts a very different approach, especially also under the previous Conservative government. So here we have the regulator, which mandates the markets to regulate themselves. And they put together, so they require the ICMA, which is an International Capital Markets Association, to develop their own code of conduct on the basis of the IOSCO recommendations. There is a limited appetite for legislative intervention. The final code of conduct, which is also published late last year, has no enforcement mechanism. It's only focused on the ratings providers themselves, so it doesn't cover, there is no oversight, there is no specific rights for the users of the ESG ratings. So it's a much narrower regime that is a self-regulatory one. Now, when we really compare the two regimes, we can find a number of interesting points of comparison. So first of all, there is EU is an authorization-based one. The UK, there is nothing so far. Neither of the regimes directly interferes with methodologies of what an ESG rating should be doing. However, the EU does it a little bit indirectly through disclosures. What we found in the interviews is that the trust perspective helps explain a lot. Also, when it comes to the regulatory design, in that in the EU, and given also the fact that in the EU, the regulation is a full-blown legislative intervention, the trust issue is perceived as a much broader one. So as I mentioned, the regulation is anchored in the EU policy agenda. It's about creating a sustainable market for sustainable finance products that is meant to accelerate the transition. In the UK, there is no such narrative. There is some reference to kind of trusted environment, but there is a much more adversarial relations between the different market participants. So whereas in the EU, the other actors, such as the users of the ratings, get enforceable rights, for example, regarding access to information vis-a-vis the ESG rating provider, given that the UK Code of Conduct is just by the industry for the industry. There are no such formalized ways for other relevant actors and trustees to take action vis-a-vis the regulatory intermediary. So at the same time, when it comes to the intervention along the different dimensions of trustworthiness, we also see some interesting differences. So when it comes to the ability of the ESG rating agencies, so the idea that they have what it takes to deliver a trustworthy piece of information. In the UK, this is a self-regulatory regime. In the EU, it's based on market entry and authorization. So there is reliance on an external public actor to confirm the ability before the service can be provided. Nevertheless, both UK and the EU rely largely on conflict of interest disclosures as a way to ascertain integrity of the ESG rating providers. However, in the EU case, there is some supervision still of these provisions. Strong references also to a high standard of independence that is required of the ESG rating providers. In the UK, this is mostly a self-reporting, no independence required type of regime. And then when it comes to kind of motivations and benevolence dimensions, in the UK, this is largely an internal governance focused regime that we see in the Code of Conduct, whereas in the EU case, there is both provisions related to internal governance, but also there are several ways in which the regulation in an interesting way requires disclosure of limitations, dependencies, kind of giving almost ways to our reasons to distrust the ratings, right? So we have this interesting dynamic where regulation is intended not just to facilitate trust and build trust, but one of the ways in which it does it is through requiring disclosure of information that can potentially question this trust, right? And there's also this role for external stakeholders and actors to keep the ESG rating providers in check. Now, this leads us to a differentiation of two types of regimes. So trust helps us identify different ways in which kind of enhanced self-regulation of sustainability transition can work. So once, even though both regimes in the UK and the EU of transition, in both jurisdictions, we have high prioritization of environmental transition in particular, both regimes are largely market-led in that they rely on market actors transitioning in tandem with mandatory legislation requiring decarbonization coming through. And in that sense, both regimes rely on regulatory intermediaries such as ESG rating providers to reduce informational asymmetries and help motivate market actors to transition. We observe these two ways in which regulatory intermediaries can be approached from a regulatory perspective. On the one hand, there can be a regime which is largely self-regulated, right? So here, in the context of kind of a narrower trust concern, there is a large deference to market actors that can be explained with a variety of historical regulatory transition reasons. However, we also identified this enforced regulation of intermediaries. So a regime whereby there is a focus on rebuilding and restoring trustworthiness of ESG rating providers by introducing a mandatory regime. Now, in the EU case, this regime is still largely actor-focused. That is, the strategies related to restoring trustworthiness focus largely on the ability, benevolence, integrity of the ESG rating providers and different ways in which both internal governance, but also relationships with other actors in the trust arena can be mobilized to increase the trustworthiness of these actors. However, still kind of slowly developing area is how can we think about the substantive dimension? That is, how do we trust that the definitions and methodologies that these actors use when assessing sustainability are still are considered trustworthy. And for this, neither the self-regulatory regime nor the EU regime provide yet an answer. There is only this indirect regulation of methodologies through providing some common elements of disclosures, but there is still reluctance to at least create a common baseline within this enhanced self-regulatory regime. So this is just to kind of summarize this. So we have we differentiate between the different enhanced self-regulatory models when it comes to both regulation by the intermediaries and what they do vis-a-vis the market participants when it comes to the real economy transition. But the one that we are most interested in is how transition can be governed indirectly by regulation of regulatory intermediaries, either through self-regulatory approaches or this enhanced and enforced self-regulatory ones. So to conclude and opening up the space for discussion, really looking forward to comments from esteemed colleagues on the call. The regulatory intermediaries are central to market-led sustainability transition because of their role in kind of trust building, trust repair, translating the noise into a signal that can meaningfully help different market actors coordinate, align, accelerate their ambition, and increase the credibility of the transition. However, the governance by intermediaries requires governance of intermediaries. And our contribution here is bringing in the trust perspective that allows to identify and differentiate the different models of governance of regulatory intermediaries, so the enforced and self-regulated, but we also bring in this nuance related to the actor-centered trust building strategies versus the strategies that are more focused also on the substantive content of what is considered as sustainable. And more generally, these differentiated models of governance of regulatory intermediaries reveal the kind of varieties of enhanced self-regulation of market-led transition. Thank you very much for the attention and looking forward to the discussion now.
Thank you so much, Agnieszka, especially because what we are presenting here is not only a work in progress, but also Agnieszka had a cold, and this presentation was delayed because I was ill a month or 6 weeks ago. So we are happy to be here. I think I'd like to conclude before opening the floor for discussion is that the concept of enforced self-regulation and the role of intermediaries is important in other fields. It is important to understand governance. It's important for a field like the digital transition, right? Content regulation, you don't want the government to do it. You want to involve the platform to do it. So there is a lot of leeway and open room to think about intermediaries and different forms of self-regulation within new arenas of governments, new and old arenas of governments. So this is the main message. And when you think about intermediaries, our case studies here is ranking and rating agencies, right, on green issues. But it can be auditing, and it can be reporting, and can be certification and registration. All those techniques create hybrid forms of regulation. But I personally don't like the hybrid, because hybrid is not refined enough. I think what we see here is combination, of course, of public and private regulation, but we keep the self-regulation, the basic forms of self-regulation, sometimes in the service, clearly in the service of public purpose, as an important mechanism of regulation. Now, we have already 2 questions. I saw Carlos first and then Edwin. So Carlos, please come in.
Hey, thank you very much. First of all, it's really nice to see both of you. Hopefully, there will be a chance to meet in person, the 3 of us, once again. But I'm looking forward to it. Anyways, thank you. It's a very promising paper. Congratulations. I have a few comments. At this stage, by the way, sorry if there is background noise. I hope you can hear me well. There is a theoretical section, there is an empirical section, and there is a sort of a synthesis. But to me, at this point, I'm missing a bit more of a consistent presentation with a more common thread, a more coherent thread that flows through the paper, because I see each of these sections a little bit disconnected from one another and perhaps pointing to different angles. So that would be my first point. Maybe to help on this, I would make the theoretical argument of the paper a bit more explicit, because it starts with this very interesting model, connecting more regulation, less regulation, more trust, less trust in intermediaries, but a little bit more of expectations that I would be expecting to see in the empirical part, also connected with this idea of self-regulation. Maybe you have it there, but it hasn't been outlined in enough detail for me to be able to follow. And I think an interesting avenue for this is, are you examining this at a certain point in time? Namely, are you examining the picture as it is now in the EU and the UK? Or are you also having a look at how these 2 approaches evolve over time? Because I'm less familiar with the case of the EU, but in the case of the UK, the trend towards more or less regulation hasn't been stable over time. So it could be quite interesting to see what has been going on in this particular case that you have been looking at. I have another point regarding your data, because you mentioned that you've had conversations with policymakers, but I don't know who with or how many, what other sources of data you have. Yeah, I mean, that would be it. And one final thing, in table 1, there is one dimension that I couldn't follow because it was titled none. It's not narrow limited. So I was curious to know which dimension you're referring to. Thank you so much. By the way, if you want to send me a version later, I can provide you with more detailed comments.
Thank you so much. Do you want to take some of the points, Agnieszka, and I will continue?
I'm happy to collect, and honestly, yeah.
Okay. Let me say only that coherence, this connection between the part, we take it into consideration. It's partly an issue of presentation, and partly we have to go for the draft paper, which is not complete, and work it out. The methods and the clarification are well taken, and the policy process should be also part of the paper. We have to go back to it, and to see how things develop. This is all useful. Thank you so much. And Edwin, please.
Yeah, maybe I just add,
Yes.
sorry, on the temporal dimension. So we would like to do it over time. The problem is that this is quite everything is happening currently, right? So the IOSCO is 2021, EU proposal is 2023, adopted 2024, UK approach is 2023. So this is all kind of moving targets. But the point about anchoring it, I mean, we do it to a little bit to an extent in the paper, but indeed kind of clarifying how this particular approach how the particular approaches adopted by the jurisdictions should be seen in the context of kind of broader post-Brexit trends. And I think like this is one of the implications also of our findings, kind of how what are the shapes of regulatory divergence between the UK and the EU in the post-Brexit world. And the different strategies that the two jurisdictions adopt also vis-a-vis the kind of global financial markets, with EU focused more on containing access and restricting access, and the UK more focused on using international fora or global standard setters on kind of influencing global regimes, especially in Asia direction. But yeah, that's a well-taken point. Yeah, sorry, Edwin.
Thank you. Edwin, please.
Yeah, so thanks so much, Agnieszka and David, for the super interesting paper. For those that don't know me, I'm Edwin Alblas, and I work as assistant professor in environmental law at the Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And I previously used the intermediary framework, which has been helpful for me in my research, where I focus on sort of how farmer collectives and intermediaries in the agricultural field can help translate government objectives to farmers, which can often be a challenge. But I was really intrigued by this example, more of private regulation and ESG standards that are not government-led, because my wife, for instance, previously worked in a flower shop, and they got a bronze rating from this private flower shop standard setter, because they use like paper instead of plastic to wrap the flowers, and they use eco soap to clean the store. But of course, every flower they sell is full of pesticides, and it's shipped from Africa, and anything that is not sort of, like all of that was not taken into account. But then you mentioned the trust repair, and I was wondering, most consumers that would come to that shop see the sign, they got a silver standard, and they would think that's awesome because now I can shop these sustainable flowers. And to me, it seems a little bit that if these intermediaries help to build the trust without any change in the actual rule setting, isn't it just like helping them to greenwash? Because to me, it seems if the rules are not changed to more ambitious levels, then, like what's the point? And consumers will not know. Usually the consumers, in my experience, have quite a lot of trust in these kind of signs because they don't know, the actual rules are very much superficial. And then I wonder also for these ESG sort of settings, if there's any incentive for these companies to raise the ambition. Because if you really take them seriously, what you see, for instance, with the B Corps and Patagonia and these kind of companies, even then they cannot meet the ambition they themselves have set, even though they're like the front runners, these kind of companies like Patagonia. There were a lot of reports where they showed that they were actually not very, sustainable either. So yeah, I really wonder about this trust. Like, is it the trust of the consumers that we're after, and is there real trust without the transparency of the rules? Currently, really not being very ambitious. Is there an incentive for these companies, these intermediaries, to change that? Because then they wouldn't be employed. I don't know. These are a lot of different things, and I understand it's really not very well structured. So even if you have some things to respond, that would be really valued. And yeah, I hope somehow this can be of help. Again, it's quite unstructured, but really interesting work and super exciting, a tricky topic, I think.
Thank you. Agnieszka, do you want to
Yeah,
start?
so I think here this is where the point of comparison between the UK and the EU regime kind of helps answer, right? So absolutely on the kind of content of what is actually considered green or not, and this is what I mentioned with the single double materiality, right? So whether a company just takes into, like, if McDonald's takes into account the risk of drought, that's the single financial materiality, and if McDonald's actually takes into account, kind of reduces its emissions, for example, that's the double materiality. Now, what the UK regime doesn't regulate this, it just says that these should be, like, ESG ratings should be transparent, and it's up to the users of the ratings to identify problems with the ratings, right? So it's that kind of a regime. In the EU, whereas you don't regulate exactly all the kind of things you need to look at to confirm whether, for example, you are environmentally how an ESG rating provider assesses an environmental performance. There are specific disclosures that are required, which kind of point the eyes of the users to particular things. For example, whether it's a financial materiality or double materiality, what are the aspects that are being taken into account. There are specific disclosures of limitations of the methodologies, right? So what I mentioned before, so you can imagine that a company, in your example, the flower shop, would be disclosing, yes, we are reducing this, but there is no data regarding the scope 3 emissions related to actually getting these flowers here, right? So there is, even if in the EU context there is no mandatory ban of importing flowers from Africa, you have a regime that requires disclosure of this information so that users can assess this. Of course, all of this relies on the motivated stakeholder who will pay attention, but yeah, I guess we can't expect governments to solve everything always. So yeah.
Yeah. Let me add that what we are in the sphere of kind of green finance in the EU, the policy discussion is very intensive. So it's a crowded field with a lot of attention, with a lot of actors with resources. So the discussion about trust and so on, and the issues around trust are repeatedly being discussed. There is a peak of attention. To some extent, like the digital issues, fake news, foreign intervention, and so on. So it didn't take a lot of effort to put the issue of ESG rating regulation, to put it into the agenda. It was already there as part of a very lively and contested arena. And the energy transition is a major issue for the EU. So all this made it probably highly important, and make it feasible to regulate them. and to do it in a cooperative way to some extent. This was not a process where the business were against regulation. Am I correct, Agnieszka? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Maybe super small
Yes.
final point about this is in the end, I'd just be interested also if we can take the next step within regulatory scholarship, in the sense that now I feel like we're heading a little bit towards alternative realities, where on paper, through the scores, same for like carbon offsetting, everything looks very positive. So you get a grade A, you get a green score, while in reality, we're crossing all the planetary boundaries, etc. So I think it would be really interesting to see if we can also take the next step, maybe by working with life scientists or these kind of things, to see, okay, actually, are these ESG scores in some way related to reality, making an actual positive impact? Because it's very easy, like this flower shop, to get a good score. And in reality, of course, like there's nothing positive about what is happening in that particular store. There's no actual transformative changes whatsoever. So I think that could be really interesting to explore, taking the next step.
I would be very interested to have if you can send me via email some links to this flower shops ranking and so on, and to continue the discussion.
Yeah, I imagine it's the same in all sort of fields, same with carbon offsetting, etc. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And Nir, please.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. It was a great presentation and very interesting research. I'll try not to repeat previous questions and start with the third research question about why should we care. So it was not clear to me. We have two different models of self-regulation. You made some contribution about the varieties of governance through intermediaries, but it was not clear to me what is actually the importance of this divergence. Those two models are what are their effects in practice? So we have those two regulatory regimes, but what do we actually learn about this divergence? That's the first question. Then, besides the coherence issue, you started by introducing the approaches, or the previous approaches, about the dyadic models and triadic models, and I was not sure also how they actually apply to the case. If that's something which doesn't really, it was interesting to have this background, but I'm not sure it actually helped, or at the end you didn't really get back to it and say something about that. So I was not sure it was actually needed or necessary. Then about the research question. So the first research question was about political dynamics, but I'm not sure you actually discussed the political dynamics in both cases. So what I actually understand, and perhaps I missed it, is about the two different regulatory approaches. It was not clear what justified each case to go to each different direction. So it would be interesting to talk about the political dynamics, or why the two cases actually diverge. But if it's not your focus, or if you're talking about two regulatory approaches, then also I would suggest to reformulate the first research question, and also to rethink about the third one. So if you want to say something about self-regulation or enhanced self-regulation, why not to bring it into the third research question and to be more focused? Then I think the criteria for comparing the two cases also should be a bit more how to say, it would be easier, or it would be, I would suggest to have like a more clear criteria, because for me, it was clear that you're going to talk about the three different trust repair strategies, but then you had several criteria for that. So I would try to make it more easier to follow, but also for yourself to think about or to put that before you start the comparison to say we are talking about 1, 2, 3 different criteria, and the trust repair issue was clear to me. That's something you are going to discuss, but then there was like a bit more tables which provides more confusion also. So that's also something you might think about. I think for the discussion, it's important. It's of course it's basic to speak about the case selection. You haven't discussed that, but that's something, of course, that should be there. But also about the generalizability of the case and what this case actually can teach us about other cases, or is it actually the right case for making your argument and your contributions about the governance, the varieties of governance through intermediaries. And one last comment. So if you made some interviews, I would be very interested to see some very interesting quotes from that in the slides, or of course in the paper. That's something that could actually bring more, I think, it could be much more interesting to see like different actors or different stakeholders speaking about or also justifying eventually the choices and the way you located the cases. But that's something already discussed before. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Nir. Agnieszka, do you want to respond?
I mean, there were so many valuable comments here. Maybe I think the question of effects of these regulatory interventions on trust is one thing that indeed we should clarify in the paper. I also appreciate that, when you are trying to summarize a paper, simultaneously explaining the broader context and the theoretical approach, sometimes you can't get into all of the things outlined in the paper. This is specifically an answer to this political dynamics point. But I think it's the answer relating to the question on the effects in practice, I think, was partly answered through the conversation that we had with Edwin, right? So the UK regime does not really allow for a meaningful discussion about the difference, doesn't create even a common baseline for understanding of what ESG ratings are, and therefore has this much broader scope for greenwashing, whereas the EU regime, because it targets both the actors and the kind of methodological, create some tenets of the methodological approach through disclosures. It does allow this, but indeed, because this is a little bit a trade-off in terms of writing about something that is currently under development, we cannot say which regime is more likely to decarbonize, which regime has contributed more to decarbonizing and having a trustworthy market-led transition, but we can say some things about how regulators can approach this problem in different ways in this institutional design reform stage. David?
Yes, we have to conclude, but let me say thank you, Nir, and all the others for the comments. I take them all as important input, and I'm grateful for them. Some of the comments are there in the paper, some are not. The issue is here is partly, this is a work in progress, but partly is to developing this kind of common language between political science and lawyers, not only between myself and Agnieszka, but also the mission is to understand and to create bridges between the legal scholarship and the regulation or public policy, political science literature. I would say that the effect, just one substantial answer is the effect that is interest for us is how do new governance structures are being developed, how political systems are dealing with issues of trust, not if they are successful or not, but what are the strategies for trust repair via institutional designs. And I think this is where we are going in terms of contribution. And I agree that we need to put it more clearly into the analysis, both in the graphs and in the paper. So thank you so much, all of you. See you again in the next webinars on intermediation. I would love to get your feedback and suggestion for new presentations and new ideas. So thank you so much and see you soon. Have a nice day.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye.